There was a strange odor in the St. Bernard Parish clerk's office in Louisiana. It wasn't the usual dusty smell of old documents and leather books, but a more biting scent, like a combination of vinegar and rust. Gerald Hutchkins detected it as soon as he walked through the heavy oak entrance on a damp August morning in 1893. He had been contracted to catalogue the parish's birth and death records going back to 1820, a task the county commissioners had put off for many years. Gerald was a very organized man. By age 34, he had already put in order 3 parish archives in the state, which gave him a name for being thorough to the point of obsession. He wore the same gray waistcoat every day he worked, brought his lunch in a metal pail, and never left a paper out of place. His wife, Caroline, would often say he treated old records with more gentleness than he did most human beings. The clerk who gave him the keys was an old man named Albert, whose hands shook a little as he motioned toward the room in the back. "Most of what you'll be needing is in there," Albert stated, with a strange note of reluctance in his voice. "The more dated materials. Well, some of those boxes haven't been touched in my whole life. I've been here 40 years. That is precisely why I'm here," Gerald answered, placing his leather bag on the floor. Albert stood in the doorway for a moment longer. "There is an area in the southeast corner. The clerks before me, they kept that part separate. Special records, they called them." He stopped, as if choosing his next words with great care. "I was instructed to leave them undisturbed. I am just telling you what I was told." Gerald gave a polite nod, already planning his strategy in his head. He had been given similar warnings before, which usually concerned papers about family arguments or challenged inheritance. It was nothing he couldn't manage with care. The room at the back was larger than it looked from the outside. High wooden shelves stood along both walls, bending from the weight of record books, tied-up letters, and boxes covered in dust. Light came in through 2 thin windows, making shafts of glowing dust motes that seemed to float in the still air. He started with the more recent items, birth records from the 1870s, which were arranged neatly and in good condition. The work went along without issue for the first 3 days. Gerald got into a routine: take out a book, confirm the year, check its condition, give it a catalog number, and then go to the next one. By Thursday afternoon, he had gone through almost 200 books. Then he got to the southeast corner. The boxes in that spot were not the same. They were older, made of a darker type of wood, and piled in a way that looked like they were meant to be hidden, not just stored. Someone had piled them up to make a kind of wall inside the room. Gerald needed to shift 7 boxes just to get to the ones that were behind them. The first box he looked inside held normal plantation documents, crop reports, receipts for equipment, and weather notes from different properties in the parish. It was historically interesting, but nothing out of the ordinary. The second box had more of the same. The third box was secured, not with a common lock, but with a wax seal that had melted and then hardened again over the metal latch. The seal had a mark on it that Gerald did not know, 3 bent lines crossing in a design that could have been initials or just a decoration. He paused for a moment. Breaking seals on old documents was not something that was encouraged, but his job was to catalogue everything. He carefully put force on the latch. The old wax broke apart, and the box creaked open. Inside, covered in an oilcloth that was now dry and brittle, were 4 ledgers, each with a brown leather cover but no titles or words on them. Gerald picked up the first one carefully. The binding was weak. The pages were yellow but not torn. He turned to the first page and saw the handwritten title, Register of Births, St. Bernard Parish, 1829 to 1834. Supplementary records, supplementary records. He had never seen that term before. The information was laid out in tidy columns: date of birth, child's name, mother's name, father's name if available, race, plantation, and the registrar's name. It was the usual information for that time. Gerald started looking through the pages, writing down notes about the condition and what was inside. Then he saw something odd. On page 12, one entry said, April 3rd, 1830. Female child, Marie. Mother Lizette, Negro. Father unknown. Race, white, Belmont Plantation. Registrar J.R. Mall. Gerald paused. He looked at it again, thinking he must have read it wrong. A child born to a mother listed as Negro was marked as white. It must have been a mistake by the clerk. He kept reading. A few entries down, April 27th, 1830, male child Thomas. Mother, Patience, Negro. Father, unknown. Race, white, Belmont Plantation. Registrar J. Arman. There was another one. He turned the pages, looking more quickly now. His heart started to beat faster with every page. June 14th, 1830. Female child, Rose. Mother, Diner, Negro. Father, unknown. Race, white, Riverside Estate. Registrar J. A. Mann. August 2nd, 1830. Male child, Henry. Mother, Esther, Negro. Father, unknown. Race, white, Oakwood Plantation. Registrar J. R. Mong. The same thing was repeated on page after page. Children born to enslaved mothers were listed as white, and every single record was signed by the same registrar, J. Armand. Gerald felt a chill spread across his chest. He looked at the date on the book again, 1829 to 1834. He opened the second book. The same thing continued from 1835 to 1841. Different plantations, different mothers, different children, but always the same racial marking, always the same person signing it, J.R. Und. By the time the sun started to set, Gerald had counted 47 of these entries in the 4 books. 47 children born to enslaved mothers between 1829 and 1847, all recorded as white, all confirmed by J. Armour. He leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. This was not a random mistake. This was done on purpose. But for what reason? Why would anyone record enslaved children as white? That night, Gerald hardly ate his dinner. Caroline saw it right away and put down her fork with a look of worry. "You look like you've witnessed something awful." "Not awful, really," he replied slowly. "Just confusing. I discovered records today that I can't explain." He told her what he had found, and he saw her face change from interested to shocked, and then to something else. Maybe it was understanding, even though she had not studied Louisiana history in depth. "Could it have been an error?" she asked. "A clerk who didn't know who the mothers were?" 47 times over 18 years, with the same person's signature on every entry, Gerald replied, shaking his head. Someone knew precisely what they were doing. "I just can't figure out what or why." Caroline was silent for a bit. "Maybe you're not meant to understand. Maybe that is the reason those boxes were hidden away." Her comment made him feel uneasy. Gerald had always treated his historical work with a sense of distance. They were events from a long time ago, involving people who were long gone. But this was not the same. This seemed intentional, and that intention suggested a reason. "I have to find out who J. Iran was," he said at last. The Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge held the records for parish employees, clerks, registrars, and other government-appointed officials. Gerald went there the next week with his notes in a locked case. The archivist, a strict woman named Mrs. Whitfield, showed him where the government appointment records were kept. He located the name in under an hour. Jacques Armand, appointed Deputy Registrar, St. Bernard Parish, January 1829, resigned November 1847. It was a period of 18 years, the same as the mysterious books. But there was another detail. Added to the appointment record was a note in a different color of ink, which seemed to have been added years later. Position terminated after an investigation. See Coroner's Inquiry, 1847, File 392. Gerald's hands were shaking a little as he asked for File 392. Mrs. Whitfield came back with a slender folder. The pages inside were fragile and had brown edges. "No one has looked at this in many years," she said. "Are you researching a particular topic?" "I'm just trying to learn about the record-keeping methods of the parish," Gerald answered, which was, in a way, the truth. The coroner's inquiry was from November 18th, 1847. The person in question was Jacques Armal, who was found dead in his house at the age of 52. The cause of death was listed as undetermined, possibly heart failure. But it was the part with the testimony that made Gerald hold his breath. A neighbor, Mrs. Violet Chanel, had stated that she had gone to see if Armand was all right after not seeing him for 3 days. She discovered him in his study, slumped over his desk. There were papers on the desk. She couldn't read very well, she had said, but she recalled seeing lists of names, children's names. The deputy who was investigating, a man named Robert Dero, had written that the dead man's study had a lot of personal records about parish registrations. The papers seemed to document births from 1829 to the present, with notes about racial categories and later transfers. The documents were taken for the parish authorities to review. Transfers. Gerald drew a line under that word in his notes. The last page of the report had a short note added 3 months later: "Investigation is closed. Materials were reviewed by the parish commission. Records have been sent back to the archive for storage. No criminal activity found. No criminal activity found." But what had they discovered? Gerald went back to St. Bernard with even more questions than he had before. He went to Albert at the clerk's office with a directness he didn't usually use. "The name, Jacques Armand, does that name have any meaning to you?" Albert's face went pale. He looked around the quiet office and then spoke in a lower voice. "How do you know that name?" "He was a registrar here. He was here for 18 years. "He was more than just a registrar," Albert said softly. "My father was employed in this office when I was a child. He spoke of armor just one time. He said that some people do the work of the devil with clean hands and official papers. What did he mean by that?" Albert shook his head. "My father never told me, but he did tell me that if I ever came across any documents with Armand's signature, I should just leave them alone. That some parts of history are best left forgotten." "But it's not forgotten," Gerald insisted. "It's in your archive, and my job is to catalog it." "Your job," Albert replied, looking him in the eye, "is to catalog the records, not to make sense of them. There is a distinction." Gerald left the office feeling troubled. Albert was either hiding something or protecting something, or maybe he really didn't know anything more than the family warnings that were passed down like old stories. He had to try a different way. The newspaper archives at the Louisiana Historical Society had copies of the St. Bernard Gazette that went back to 1825. Gerald spent 2 whole days looking through the issues from 1829 to 1847, trying to find any mention of Arand, strange birth registrations, or arguments about racial classifications. He found almost nothing. There were a few small mentions, like Deputy Registrar J. Armand has confirmed the registration of 12 births this month, which were just standard administrative notices. But in the October 1847 issue, in the section for local news, there was a single paragraph. "The community is sad to announce the death of Mr. Jacques Armal, Deputy Registrar, whose dedicated work for our parish lasted 18 years. Mr. Armand was well regarded for his careful record-keeping and commitment to administrative correctness. He has no surviving close family. The funeral services were private, no close family, 18 years of work, nothing controversial, nothing suspicious. Just a government worker who had passed away and was briefly remembered. And yet, someone had put his personal records under a wax seal. Someone had hidden the supplementary books. Someone had instructed the clerks to not touch them. Gerald had to know what had happened to those children. The next step of his research involved a different kind of searching. If children who were born to enslaved mothers were recorded as white, there ought to be other records, like sales, transfers, freedom papers, or death records. Gerald started to compare the names from Armand's books with other parish documents. Marie, born on April 3, 1830, to let at Belmont Plantation. Gerald looked through the Belmont records, which were now at the parish archive. The plantation had been sold in 1856, and its documents had been moved to county storage. He found Lizette's name in the slave list from 1829. She was listed as a house servant, 22 years old. In the 1831 list, there was a note next to her name, one child, Marie, transferred separately, not sold with her mother, which was the usual practice for very young children. He looked for Marie in later records. There was nothing in Belmont's slave lists. There was nothing in the sales records from nearby plantations. But then, in a tax document from 1832, he discovered an entry for Belmont Plantation that listed a Marie Belmont household apprentice in the section for free persons of color employed, free at the age of 2. Gerald followed the name through the years. Marie Belmont was mentioned in parish records from time to time. She was enrolled in a school in 1838, which was not common for free people of color, but not unheard of. She signed her name as a witness on a property document in 1851, so she was able to write then. And finally, there was a marriage record from 1854 to a man named Charles Riviere, who was also listed as a free person of color. But here was the most important detail. Marie's race on the marriage certificate was listed as white, not free person of color. White. Gerald sat in complete silence, stunned. A child born to an enslaved woman had somehow been reclassified, somehow set free, and somehow given the status of a white person, all before she was 24 years old. He looked at another name, Thomas, born on April 27, 1830. The same pattern was there, registered as white at birth, moved separately from his enslaved mother within 2 years, showed up later in records as a free child, and then eventually as a white person in his adult documents. One by one, Gerald followed the 47 children through the incomplete records he could find. 23 of them had similar stories. The others just disappeared from the records completely after their first birth registration and supervising every initial registration. J. Armand. By October of 1893, Gerald had filled 6 notebooks with what he had found. He would work late into the night, matching dates, following names, and tracing the movement of children between parishes and over decades. Caroline was concerned about his health. He had lost weight, had dark rings under his eyes, and had stopped going to church events. "You need to show this to someone," she insisted. "If what you found is true, historians need to know about it." "It is true," Gerald said, "but I haven't figured out how it worked yet. How did this take place? Who gave the order? Why these particular children?" He was missing a key piece of information, something that would connect everything and make it all make sense. The solution came in an unexpected way, not from papers, but from a person. In the early part of November, an elderly woman named Josephine Durant visited the parish office to get a copy of her birth record. She was 83, she informed Gerald, and was born in St. Bernard Parish in 1810. She required the paper for a matter of property inheritance in New Orleans. Gerald found her record without any trouble. She had been born free to parents who were also free people of color, which was a fairly simple case. As he was getting the certified copy ready, he made some polite small talk and mentioned that he was looking into historical record-keeping methods. "Did you by any chance know a man named Jacques Armand?" he asked in a casual way. "He was a registrar here many years ago." Josephine's hand, which was reaching for the document, stopped in midair. Her eyes, which were clouded by age but still very sharp, looked directly at Gerald's face. "Why are you asking about him?" The way she said it made Gerald think carefully about what to say next. "I discovered some strange entries in old ledgers. His name was there many times. I am too trying to figure out the context." Josephine slowly sat down in the chair that was opposite his desk. For a long time she was silent, her fingers twisting the material of her shawl. "I knew of Amo," she finally said. "Everyone in the colored community knew about him, but we didn't say his name much. We still don't. What did he do?" "He had 2 sets of records," she said slowly, as if she were retrieving memories from a long time ago, the official records and the other records. "My aunt was a midwife. She delivered babies on half of the plantations in this parish. She told me some things near the end of her life, things she had seen." Gerald leaned in closer. "What sort of things?" "When certain babies were born, babies with skin that was light enough to pass for white, born to enslaved women, Armand would be sent for. Not right away. Sometimes it was weeks later. He would come with his books and look at the child. If the child was light enough, if their features were acceptable, he would register them as white," Gerald said. Josephine nodded. "Then the child would vanish from the plantation. Within a year, sometimes in just a few months. The mothers were told that their babies had died. Some of them believed it. Others, she stopped. Others knew it wasn't true, but they couldn't do anything about it. Where did the children go? I don't know for sure. Aunt Matilda had her ideas. She thought they were taken up north or to New Orleans, and given to families who were not able to have children or who wanted servants they could pass off as orphan relatives. Children with light skin could be raised as white, you see? Especially if their papers said they were white from the time they were born." The room seemed to get colder. Gerald's organized mind was putting the pieces together to form a picture he did not want to see. "How many children?" he asked. "I couldn't tell you. Aunt Matilda delivered hundreds of babies in her 40 years. She guessed there were maybe 50 or 60 that Armand was interested in, but she only worked at certain plantations. If he was doing this all over the parish..." Josephine's voice trailed off. "Did anyone try to stop him?" Josephine's laugh was a bitter one. Stop a white official who was making legal registrations? With what kind of power? The mothers were property. The babies were property. If someone in a position of authority decided to change the classification of that property to human, to white, to free, who would have a problem with that? The plantation owners? The question remained in the air. It was rhetorical, but it was also devastating. Why would the plantation owners permit it? Gerald asked. They were losing valuable. He had trouble saying the word assets. Were they? Josephine tilted her head. "Consider it. A baby that is born too light creates issues. Other enslaved people start asking questions. The overseers ask questions. Visitors take notice. And if that child gets older and looks white, you can't sell them easily. You can't make them work in the fields without people noticing. It's simpler to make them disappear legally." Armand offered a solution. He made difficult problems disappear into paperwork. Gerald felt ill. The cold logic of it was undeniable. The organized way it was done, the bureaucratic smoothness. was in some ways more unsettling than any random act of cruelty. "You're a N.T.," he said with care. "Did she ever find out what happened to the children later?" She heard rumors. She thought she saw one of them years later, a young woman in New Orleans, maybe about 20 years old, who was working as a governess for a rich family. The woman had a birthmark on her neck, a St. Mark that Aunt Matilda remembered from a baby she had delivered to an enslaved woman named Ruth. But when she tried to talk to the young woman, she didn't recognize her. The young woman spoke perfectly, was dressed in nice clothes, and looked right through Aunt Matilda as if she were not there. She did not remember. She was taken when she was 8 months old, according to what Aunt Matilda recalled. How could she remember? For all she knew, she was exactly who her papers said she was, a white orphan who was raised by a kind family. The meaning of this all cascaded through Gerald's mind. Stolen identities, erased histories, children who would never know their mothers, their real origins, or the truth about themselves. "Why are you sharing this with me?" he asked Josephine. She got up slowly and took her certified birth document. "Because you asked, and because I am 83 years old. Anyone who knew about this for sure is either dead or close to it. If someone is finally looking at those records and finally asking questions, then maybe it is time for the answers to be said out loud, even if there is nothing that can be done about it now." She went to the door and then stopped. Armand kept those books separate for a reason. He knew that what he was doing was legal, but it was not right. "That is a special kind of evil, Mr. Hutchkins, the kind of evil that fills out forms in triplicate." After she had gone, Gerald sat in the quiet office as it got dark outside. He thought about those children, toddlers who were taken from their mothers and given new names, sometimes new families, and new identities that were made up of lies and confirmed with official stamps. Some people might say they were given better lives, with freedom, chances, and a way to get out of slavery. But they had been stolen. Their mothers had grieved, and they had been made into lies that they would carry with them, without knowing it, for the rest of their lives. Gerald's investigation took on a new sense of urgency. He started to look into Jacques Armand's personal background, searching for some context, a reason, or the starting point of this systematic reclassification. Armand had moved to Louisiana from France in 1825, at the age of 30. He had a short job as a clerk for a shipping business in New Orleans before he was appointed as the deputy registrar in St. Bernard Parish in 1829. He had no wife, no children of his own, and no major property. From all accounts, he was a minor government worker who lived a quiet and ordinary life. But Gerald discovered something else. In the collection of letters between parish officials, there was a letter from March 1829, written by a man named Philip Grosvenor, a rich landowner who was on the parish commission. The letter recommended Armand for the position of deputy registrar, complimenting his discretion and his ability to handle delicate administrative matters. Delicate administrative matters. Gerald looked up Grosvenor's property records. The Groner family had owned Belmont Plantation, where many of the reclassified children had been born, until they sold it in 1851. Philip Grosvenor had passed away in 1853. The connections were becoming clear. Groner had gotten Armand the job. Armand had then offered a service, taking care of delicate matters that were good for plantation owners like Groner. But it went beyond just Belmont. Gerald's list had children from at least 12 different plantations. This was not just one plantation owner solving a personal issue. This was an organized operation. He found the next piece of the puzzle in the bank records. By looking at property tax documents, Gerald learned that Jacques Armand had an account at the First Louisiana Bank in New Orleans. The records from Armand's death showed that the account had $4,200 in it, at that time. That was a very large amount of money for a parish clerk whose yearly pay was about $300. Where did that money come from? Gerald was not able to see the detailed bank records as they were private, but the amount suggested that he had been getting regular payments for many years. Payments from who? For what kind of service? The implications were obvious. Armand had not done this because of his beliefs or out of misplaced kindness. He had been paid to reclassify children, to move them out of slavery through legal papers, and to make difficult situations go away. But who paid him? The plantation owners directly? Or was there some other group in between? In January of 1894, Gerald found the advertisements. He had been looking through New Orleans newspapers from the 1830s and 1840s, trying to find any mention of Armand or the plantations on his list. He almost didn't see them. They were small and usually hidden in the back pages, next to notices for livestock auct, ions, and shipping schedules. The first one he found was in the April 1831 issue of the New Orleans Mercantile, seeking placement, light-complexioned infant girl, in excellent health, suitable for household service or adoption into a respectable family. Inquiries to P.G., care of Deroux and Associates, 127 Rue Royale. P.G. Philip Grovena. Gerald found 6 more similar ads over the next 3 years. The wording was slightly different, but the basic format was the same. Light-complexioned infant, excellent health, placement wanted, inquiries to be sent to initials, care of Devo and Associates. He had seen that name before. Deo. Robert Deo. No, Devo had been the deputy who looked into Armand's death. The connections were all coming together. Grosvenor suggests Armand for the job. Armand registers the children as white. The children are then transferred. Ads appear looking for placements. Devo takes care of the inquiries, and then years later he investigates Armand's death and dismisses the case without any criminal charges. It was a network, a quiet, bureaucratic network that had been running for almost 20 years, moving children from slavery into a false freedom, all while keeping careful legal records. But Gerald still couldn't figure out the most basic question: what happened to the children who were placed? The solution came from a place he didn't expect. In March of 1894, Gerald got a letter that had been sent on from the parish clerk's office. It was from a man named Edmund Porter, who was a lawyer in Mobile, Alabama. Porter had seen a short article that Gerald had written in the Louisiana Historical Quarterly about strange record-keeping practices in parishes before the Civil War. Gerald had been careful with his words, only mentioning differences in racial classifications without giving away the full extent of what he had found. Porter's letter was written with great care. Dear Mr. Hutchkins, your recent article about classification irregularities in Louisiana parish records is very similar to a case I am currently working on. A client of mine, a woman of 73, recently found out that her birth record from St. Bernard Parish has details that do not match her family's history as she knew it. She was always told that she was born to a white family that died in a yellow fever epidemic, and that she was brought up by relatives who adopted her. However, a recent look at her papers has brought up some questions. If you have any information about irregular birth registrations from St. Bernard Parish around 1830 to 1840, I would be very interested in hearing from you. This is a matter of great personal importance to my client. Gerald answered right away, asking for more information. Porter's reply came within 2 weeks. My client, who I will refer to as Mrs. L for her privacy, has a birth certificate from St. Bernard Parish in 1832 that states her race as white and her mother as having died during childbirth. However, she recently came across a conflicting document among her family's papers. a bill of sale from 1833 for one female child, light-skinned, named Lily, born to a Negro woman named Grace. The description of the child is consistent with details my client recalls from her own early years. The bill is signed by a notary named J. Armand. Mrs. L. is very distressed and wants to find out her true background. J. Armand had notarized the say, "Le." Of course he had. He wasn't just registering these children, he was managing the entire transfer process. Gerald wrote back to ask if Porter could provide the names involved. Another exchange of letters provided the details. The child, Lily, was born at Riverside Estate in 1832. Her mother, Grace, had passed away in 1835. According to the plantation records, the child had been sold to a family in Mobile called the Prescotts, who had raised her as if she were their orphaned niece. Gerald looked in his ledgers. There it was, May 19, 1832. Female child, Lily, mother Grace, Negro, father unknown, race white, Riverside Estate, Registrar J. Armand. Mrs. L. was one of the 47. Over the next few months, Gerald and Porter wrote many letters to each other. Porter was helping Mrs. L. try to claim an inheritance from her biological mother's family. It was a hopeless case in legal terms, as Porter acknowledged, since enslaved people could not leave behind property. But the principle of the matter was important to his client. She wanted her true origins to be recognized. Through Porter, Gerald found out what had happened to at least one of the reclassified children. She was sold to a family that was desperate for a child, or that wanted a servant they could raise without the social issues of slavery, or maybe they truly thought they were saving an orphan. The people who bought her were given perfect documents, white birth certificates that were signed by an official registrar. The children were so young that they had no memories of what had happened. The mothers were not able to object or go looking for them. It was trafficking, Gerald realized. It was legal, documented, and bureaucratically processed trafficking of children that was made to look like legitimate birth registration and orphan placement. And Armand was the one who had designed it all. Gerald's work became more widely known in 1895 when he presented his initial findings at the annual conference of the Louisiana Historical Association. He was cautious with his words, describing it as a study of administrative inconsistencies in pre-Civil War record systems, but the implications were obvious to anyone who was listening closely. The reaction was varied. Some historians were intrigued and saw possibilities for more research. Others were unfriendly, implying that Gerald was making up a controversy or misreading simple mistakes. One well-known professor from Tulane dismissed the whole thing as just statistical anomalies in a system that was not well supervised. But Gerald also got letters, 7 of them in the next year, from people in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Each letter had a similar tale: family papers that didn't match the official records, elderly relatives who had faint memories of children who went to live with other families, and birth certificates signed by J. Armand that didn't align with family stories. One letter was from a woman in Natchez who had discovered her grandmother's diary. Her grandmother had been a free woman of color in the 1830s who worked as a seamstress. She had written about her sister, who was an enslaved woman on a Louisiana plantation and had given birth to a daughter with light skin. The entry from 1834 stated, "Louise's baby is no longer here. They said the fever took it, but there was no fever. I saw the child 2 weeks ago and it was healthy and strong. Now, Louisa will not talk. She just looks at the wall." Another letter was from a man whose grandfather had been a blacksmith in St. Bernard Parish. The grandfather had kept a journal to record his business dealings. One entry from 1839 mentioned, made small hinges for a travel basket on a special order. The customer was that French registrar fellow. He said it was for carrying documents, but the basket was lined with blankets. A strange commission, travel baskets lined with blankets. Gerald's stomach churned. By 1896 he had found 73 cases, the original 47 from Armand's personal ledgers, and 26 more that he had discovered by comparing plantation records with Armand's official registrations. Not all of them had the same story. Some children had been registered with their race left empty or with unclear notes like under review or pending classification. But the main group, the 47 from the supplementary ledgers, were all clear, and in every single case, Jacques Carme's signature was there. Gerald tried to get a full paper on his findings published. 3 academic journals turned him down. The editor's reasons were different, but the main message was the same. It was too controversial, too speculative, and there was not enough direct proof of criminal intent. "You have a correlation," one editor wrote, "but you cannot prove for certain that there was a conspiracy. Armand has been dead for a long time. The children, if they are still alive, would be in their 60 or 70 now, living as white citizens with no idea about your research. What is the point of revealing this, other than to cause social problems?" The question stayed with Gerald. What was he trying to achieve? Justice for the mothers, recognition of what had been done, a small historical note that would be read by a few scholars and then forgotten? Or was he just not able to let the mystery go unsolved? In May of 1896, Gerald went to New Orleans to look at property records at the notarial archives. He was trying to find any properties that Jacques Armand owned besides his house in St. Bernard Parish. He found one, a small warehouse near the docks that was bought in 1832 and sold in 1846. The property records had a short description: storage facility for documents and administrative materials. Gerald found the person who currently owned the property. It had been sold 4 times since Armand owned it. The current owner, a merchant named Theodore Bruno, was willing to let Gerald look at the building for a small price. The warehouse was long and thin and didn't look like much, squeezed between 2 bigger commercial buildings. Bruno said it was mostly used for storing imported fabrics. Now, the previous owner used it for similar things, he said. Before that, I couldn't say. "Would it be all right if I look at the structure?" Gerald asked. "Sometimes old buildings have historical items left in them." Bruno shrugged. "Look wherever you want. Just don't break anything." Gerald spent 3 hours looking through the warehouse. The first floor didn't have anything unusual. There were empty wooden boxes, leftover pieces of fabric wrappings and dust, but there was a small upper floor that could be reached by a narrow set of stairs. The room on the upper floor was about 12 feet by 15 feet. There were 2 small windows that were now painted over and faced an alley. The wood on floor had signs of old water damage in one corner. Other than that, the room was empty. Gerald walked around the edge of the room slowly, checking the floorboards and looking at the walls. He was about to leave when he saw something strange about the chimney breast. The brickwork in that area was a little different. The mortar was newer, and the color was slightly off. He pushed on the bricks to test them. One of them moved. Gerald carefully took out 6 bricks from a spot about 4 feet up from the floor. Behind them was a space, and inside that space was a leather bag that was stiff from age and dampness. His heart was racing as Gerald took out the bag and brought it over to the window to get a better look. The leather was cracked and had mold on it, but the things inside were safe inside an oilcloth wrapping, papers, folded documents, and a small notebook. The cover of the notebook had no markings. Gerald opened it carefully, being mindful of the fragile pages. The first page had neat handwriting that said, "Private Record of Placements, Jr., 1829 to 1847. To be destroyed upon my death." But it had not been destroyed. It had been hidden. The notebook had names, dates, and places. Each entry had the same format: child's name, birth date, mother, birth plantation, placed with, location, date of transfer, and fee received. Gerald's hands were shaking as he read Marie, April 3rd, 1830. Liette Belmont, Mr. and Mrs. Laurent Duchamp, New Orleans, June 1830. $200. Thomas, April 27th, 1830. Patience Belmont, July 1830. $150. Rose, June 14th, 1830. Diner, Riverside. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Beaufort, Mobile, August 1830. $225. The list went on, with 79 entries in total, which was more than Gerald had found. Each one had a price, a destination, and represented a child who was taken from their mother and given a new identity. The prices ranged from $150 to $400, and it seemed to be based on the child's age and skin color. Younger and lighter-skinned children were more expensive, but there was more. Attached to the back of the notebook were 7 letters, which were faded but still readable. They were from families who wanted to get a suitable child for domestic upbringing or to adopt an orphaned infant in need of a Christian home. One letter from February 1835 from a couple in Charleston was especially cold in its businesslike tone. Dear Mr. Armand, we were given your name by Mr. Grosvenor as someone who could help with a sensitive family issue. We have not been able to have children after 10 years of marriage. We are looking to get a female infant, preferably younger than 6 months, with a light complexion, who would be suitable for raising as our own daughter. We understand that the necessary paperwork can be arranged to show a legitimate birth. We are willing to pay well for your services and discretion. Please let us know if you have anyone available. Armand had apparently replied, because a note in his notebook read, Eleanor, November, 1835, Josephine Oakwood. Mr. and Mrs. R. Winslow, Charleston, $375. This was not just a crime of opportunity. This was a business. Armand had created a market for children who could pass as white. He connected families who were either desperate or unethical with enslaved infants, managed the transfers with legal papers, and made a profit from it all. The supplementary ledgers were not mistakes or oddities. They were receipts. Gerald was faced with a difficult moral choice. If he published this information, it would cause a huge scandal. It would reveal a criminal operation, yes, but it could also cause great harm to people who were still alive. Elderly men and women who had lived their whole lives thinking they were white, who had built families and reputations based on identities that were created for them before they could even talk. Mrs. L. in Mobile had decided to look into her past, but how many other people would want to make that choice? How many would rather not know? Caroline listened as he struggled with the choice, walking back and forth in their small living room late at night. You are asking if the truth is worth the pain it might cause, she said at last. Yes, I cannot give you the answer to that, but I will ask you this. If those mothers could speak right now, what would they want? Gerald stopped walking. He thought about Lisette, who had lost Marie, about Grace, who had lost Lily, and about the women whose names he didn't know, whose children had been taken away in the dark, who had been told their babies had died, and who had lived with that sorrow for the rest of their lives. They would want their children to know, he said softly. They would want the truth to be told. Then you have your answer. Gerald's detailed report, Systematic Racial Reclassification in Antebellum Louisiana, The Almond Ledgers, 1829 to 1847, was published in June 1897 by the American Historical Review, one of the few journals that was willing to publish such controversial material. The reaction was immediate and strong. Several Louisiana families threatened to sue, saying that Gerald was ruining their family names with claims that had no proof. The St. Bernard Parish Commission released an official statement that questioned whether the documents Gerald had used were real. 3 well-known historians wrote articles arguing that Gerald had misunderstood normal administrative differences, but other people took his research seriously. Genealogical societies started to investigate. Journalists wrote articles, and slowly, very slowly, more proof came to light. A woman in Virginia found out that her grandfather's birth certificate had been changed. The original ink showed that Negro had been crossed out and replaced with white, and it was signed by J. Almond. A family in Kentucky discovered letters in their attic that suggested their great-grandmother had been acquired through a charity organization in New Orleans in 1836. A historian in South Carolina found similar patterns of reclassification in other parishes, but none of them were as organized as Almond's operation. The academic discussion went on for years. Some scholars believed that Gerald had revealed a major and previously unknown part of pre-Civil War racial dynamics. Others maintained that he had exaggerated a few coincidences and turned them into a conspiracy theory. What no one could deny was that the ledgers existed, the pattern of registrations was there, and there was a connection with the advertisements and transfers. Gerald kept up his research until he passed away in 1908. By that time he had found 112 children who had been processed through Almond's system. He had managed to follow 34 of them into their adult lives through various records. Most of them had lived as white citizens with no idea of their real origins. Several had married into well-known families. At least 2 of them had owned slaves themselves. That last fact was particularly haunting to Gerald. Children who were stolen from slavery, raised as white, and then went on to become slave owners. The cruel irony of it was almost too much to comprehend. In his last notebook, which he wrote during the sickness that would eventually take his life, Gerald thought about what he had discovered. I started out to catalog records, but instead, I cataloged lives. Lives that were stolen, lives that were made up, lives that were built on a foundation of lies. Jacques Armand is seen in history as a minor official, who died alone and without much notice. But his legacy is carried on in the bodies of people who do not know they have it. His crime was paperwork, his weapon was a pen, and his victims were not only the mothers who lost their children, but the children themselves who lost their truth. I am often asked if my research achieved anything. I cannot say for sure. The mothers are all gone. The children, who are now old, if they are still alive, will probably never find out. The system that allowed Armand to do what he did is long gone, but the documents are still there, and I have come to learn that documentation is a kind of testimony in itself. It speaks when people are silenced. It keeps what those in power want to be forgotten. Whether anyone pays attention is not up to me. The ledgers that Gerald found are still in the Louisiana State Archives today. They are catalogued under St. Bernard Parish Administrative Records, Supplementary Materials, 1829 to 1847. Researchers can ask to see them, but not many do. The notebook from the warehouse, which was Gerald's most important discovery, was given to the archive by his estate in 1909, along with all of his research notes and letters. Every now and then, someone asks for the materials. It is usually genealogists who are tracing their family histories. Sometimes it is historians who are researching Louisiana before the Civil War. It is rare for journalists to investigate historical injustices. They all discover the same thing that Gerald found. 79 children recorded in Armand's private notebook, 47 in the supplementary ledgers, and many more that are suggested by the missing information in plantation records and the pattern of transfers. And in every single entry, one name is there as the person who certified it, the notary, the registrar who made it all legal, J. Arand. In 1983, a graduate student at Louisiana State University named Rebecca Chen was doing research on racial classification systems for her dissertation. She got access to the Armand materials and started to compare them with genealogical databases that were now available because of computers. She discovered something that Gerald Hutchkins did not have the technology to find. Using birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, and census data, Rebecca was able to trace the descendants of 12 of the children from Armand's ledgers, not the children themselves, as they had all been dead for a long time, but their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. She calculated that those 12 children alone had about 2,400 living descendants as of 1983. 2,400 people who were living all over the United States, most of whom identified as white, and none of whom knew that their great-great-grandfather or great-great-grandmother had been born to an enslaved woman and had been processed through Jacques Armand's reclassification system. Rebecca sat in the archive's reading room, looking at her computer printouts, and struggled with the same ethical problem that Gerald had faced 90 years before. Should she publish this? She chose not to. Her dissertation looked at the administrative methods of racial classification, but she did not identify any modern families. The Armand case was just a footnote, a documented instance of systematic reclassification that was mentioned briefly and then left in the historical records for other people to find or ignore as they saw fit. The complete truth about Jacques Armand's operation is still not fully known. Why did he begin? Did he think he was helping the children, or was it just for the money? Was he forced into the role, or did he create the system himself? There are no personal letters left to tell us what he was thinking. There is no diary to explain his reasons. Only the ledgers are left. They are cold, precise, and methodical, recording children who were changed from enslaved to free, from black to white, and from one identity to another, all with a simple stroke of a pen. The mothers' stories are even harder to find. Enslaved women are rarely mentioned in historical records, except as items in property lists. We only know their names because Armand wrote them down as the mothers of the children he reclassified: Let, Grace, Dina, Esther, Patience, Josephine. These were women who gave birth and then had their children taken away. Not by death, which was sad enough, but by a legal trick that made them non-existent as mothers. There is a box in the Louisiana State Archives with the reference code SBP 1829 SUP that holds the 4 supplementary ledgers that Gerald Hutchkins discovered in 1893. The box has a note on it that was added by an archivist in 1974, contains sensitive genealogical material. Researchers who request access must sign a disclosure agreement. Inside the front cover of the first ledger, someone, maybe Gerald or maybe an archivist, has put a small card with typed words. These records document children born between 1829 and 1847, who are registered with racial classifications that do not match their maternal lineage. The individuals named in these records were reclassified through legal processes managed by Deputy Registrar Jacques Armand. Descendants of these individuals may not be aware of the circumstances of their ancestors' births. Please handle this information with appropriate sensitivity. Appropriate sensitivity, as if there is a proper way to deal with the discovery that identities were stolen, lives were made up, and mother's sorrow was hidden away in government files marked supplementary. The ledgers themselves are just ordinary objects, brown leather, ink that is fading, and yellowed pages. They look just like any other administrative record from that time. There is nothing about how they look that would suggest the importance of what is inside them. But when you open them and read the entries, line after line, page after page, year after year, always with that same signature at the end, the systematic way it was done becomes very real. This was not just chaos or the cruelty of one person. This was organized, documented, and paid for. It was evil, as Josephine Durant had noted, that filled out forms in triplicate. In 2003, a genealogist who was working on a family tree for a client in Atlanta found a discrepancy. The client's great-great-grandmother, Martha, had a birth certificate from St. Bernard Parish from 1841 that listed her race as white and her parents as unknown, as if she were an orphan at birth. But attached to the certificate, which seemed to be by mistake when the documents were copied years ago, was a single page from what looked like a plantation inventory. The page listed, birth female, child to Hannah, light complexion, reported to registrar. The birth dates were the same. The genealogist, following the rules of her profession, told her client what she had found. The client asked for no more investigation. The genealogist filed her notes and went on to other work. But she did one more check before she closed the file. She looked up who had signed Martha's birth certificate, J. Arend. She had never heard the name before, so she did a quick search in the historical databases. She found Gerald Hutchins's paper from 1897. She read it all in one go and then went back to look at her client's documents again. Martha was one of the 79. The genealogist sent a short email to the Louisiana State Archives to ask if the Armin materials had been digitized. They had not. The archivist explained it was because of budget cuts. Maybe someday. Someday the ledgers might be scanned, made searchable, and cross-referenced with national genealogical databases. Someday thousands of people might find out that their ancestors were part of Jacques' Arma system, but not yet. For now, the ledgers are in their box in a climate-controlled room, waiting for researchers who almost never come. The last person known to have looked at all of the Armin materials in detail was a documentary filmmaker in 2011. She was working on a project about the hidden histories of slavery in Louisiana. She spent 2 weeks with the ledgers, taking pictures of the pages, writing notes, and planning interviews. The documentary was never finished. She later explained that the funding was cut, and the topic turned out to be too legally difficult. Families threatened to sue before a single scene was even filmed. Her production company put the project on hold, but she kept her research notes. In an interview years later, she said, "What bothered me the most was not how evil it was. We all know that slavery was evil. It was the paperwork. Someone made forms for this. Someone created procedures. Someone sat in an office and figured out all the details. How to document the theft of a child, how to create a legal identity out of thin air, how to make a human being disappear and then reappear as someone completely different. And then they did it 79 times that we know of, maybe hundreds of times in total, and they filed everything correctly. That is probably the most disturbing part of the Armin case. It wasn't hidden at the time. It was official, recorded, and filed in government archives. The hiding came later, when someone, we don't know who, sealed the ledgers and put them in a corner. But even that was not destruction. Whoever hid them decided to keep them, locked away but whole. Why? Was it guilt? a feeling that the records might be important someday. Or was it just a simple bureaucratic habit that documents are not destroyed but filed away? We will probably never know. Jacques Armour died in November of 1847 at his home in St. Bernard Parish. The coroner who looked at his body saw no signs of violence or any obvious illness. He was found at his desk with a pen in his hand and a partially finished entry in front of him. The entry, which was saved in the coroner's report, said, November 15, 1847, male child, unnamed, mother Rachel, Negro, father, unknown, race, the race field was empty. Whatever Armour was about to write, death stopped him. The child was never registered. There is no later record of a baby being born to Rachel at any plantation in St. Bernard in November 1847. Either the child died or someone else finished the registration without Armand's help, or the birth itself was never officially recorded. It was Armand's last entry, his final action in a system he had run for 18 years. He was buried in the St. Bernard Parish Cemetery in a plot that has no gravestone left. The records show where it is, but the marker has either disappeared or worn away so much that it can't be read. No descendants claimed the plot, and no one took care of it. Jacques Armand now exists mostly as a signature on documents and a name in historical papers. He was a man who processed children through paperwork, who turned human beings into business deals, who built a business on separating families, and who died at his desk in the middle of another entry. The mother's stories are more difficult to follow. Enslaved women are rarely mentioned in historical records, except as lists of property. We only know their aims, because Armand wrote them down as the mothers of the children he reclassified. Let, who gave birth to Marie in 1830, is in the Belmont plantation records until 1844. Then her name is gone. She was possibly sold, or she died, or she was just recorded somewhere else under different papers. Grace, who gave birth to Lily in 1832, is listed as deceased in 1835. The cause of death is not given. Dinina, the mother of Rose, is in the records until 1852. A note next to her name in an 1843 inventory says, age approximately 35, field worker, reduced productivity. There are no other details. These small pieces of information are all that is left. Women who carried children, gave birth, and then had those children taken away and legally erased. Whether they knew their children were alive, whether they hoped to see them again, whether they grieved for them as dead, or lost, or stolen, none of that was written down. The system did not require their sadness to be documented, so it was not. There is a question that researchers sometimes ask when they study the Armand case. What happened to the children who were raised as white? Did they have better lives than they would have had as enslaved people? It is a question that is impossible to answer, and many people say it is the wrong question to ask in the first place. It suggests that the only two choices were to be enslaved or to be stolen, when the real moral choice, to end slavery, was an option that their society simply refused to take. But the question is still asked, because the answer is not simple. Some of the children that Armand placed were raised in comfortable situations. They were educated and given chances that they would have been denied in slavery. Marie, the first name in Armand's notebook, grew up in New Orleans with the Duchamp family. Records show that she learned to read and write, married a free man of color, and lived until she was 68. Others had a harder time. Gerald's research suggested that at least 11 of the reclassified children were basically indentured servants who were legally free but were practically tied to the families who had bought them through debt, manipulation, or just because they had no other options. and all of them, no matter what their material situation was, lived lives that were based on lies. They did not know they were living lies, which probably made it easier. But the truth was still hidden under legal documents and false stories. In 1999, a historical preservation group in St. Bernard Parish put up a small memorial in the county courthouse. The plaque says, "In memory of the enslaved mothers and children of St. Bernard Parish whose families were separated through both illegal and legal means. May their names be remembered and their stories acknowledged." It does not mention Jacques Armand by name. It does not go into detail about his system or the extent of the reclassifications. It is intentionally vague, a compromise between the desire to acknowledge what happened without saying who was hurt or how. Some local historians said that even that vague memorial was not appropriate, that it was bringing up a painful history that could not be fixed and only created more division. Others said it did not go far enough, that naming Armand and documenting the specific crimes was essential for a true historical accounting. The memorial was vandalized twice in its first year, and both times it was repaired. Now it stands quietly in the courthouse lobby, and hundreds of people walk by it every week, most of whom do not stop to read it. The last known verified descendant to find out about their connection to Armand's system was a man named David Pritchard, who discovered the truth in 2007 while he was researching his family's genealogy for his grandchildren. David was 71, a retired schoolteacher in Mississippi. He had grown up thinking that his great-grandmother Elizabeth was an orphan who was raised by a kind family in Louisiana. That was the story that had been passed down for 4 generations. But when David got Elizabeth's actual birth records for his genealogy project, he found some things that didn't match up. Her birth certificate said her race was white, her mother was unknown, and her birthplace was St. Bernard Parish in 1838. The registrar's signature was J. Arund. The name sounded familiar to him. He searched online and found references to Gerald Hutchins's research. Then he found the archived ledgers, which were now partially digitized, and he saw an entry, Elizabeth, March 12, 1838. Miriam, Riverside. Mr. and Mrs. Stephen Landry, Baton Rouge, April 1838. $200. His great-grandmother had been born to an enslaved woman named Miriam, and then sold as an infant for $280 to the family who had raised her. David took months to process this information. He later wrote in a personal essay that he experienced a kind of identity vertigo. Everything he had believed about his family's history, his heritage, and his ancestry was suddenly no longer certain. He was white. He had lived for 71 years as a white man, but his great-grandmother had been born to a black enslaved woman. What did that make him? What was the truth of his identity? He did not make his discovery public. He told his children and grandchildren, showed them the documents, and let them decide what it meant for their own sense of who they were. Some of them were fascinated and wanted to research more. Others were uncomfortable and didn't know how to fit this information into their understanding of themselves. David wrote, "I don't know if learning this truth made my life better or worse. I only know that it is the truth, and I